Hello, welcome to my observations from my trip to France. This is the first video. Reception. A lot of Americans go to France and return having reports only that French people are rude, ungrateful, and unwelcoming. I I spent most of my time in Normandy and Brittany, with a little bit of time in the Loire Valley, and then I was only really in Ile-de-France or Paris because you have to fly into Charles de Gaulle and out of Charles de Gaulle if you're on an international flight across the Atlantic. So my experience in Paris was strictly limited. What I did find was this. I happened to be in France right around the 8th of May. The 8th of May is VE Day, a day that we don't really think about much in the United States because despite the fact that we were victorious in Europe, our Second World War was not over yet, as opposed to France, where theirs was basically ended. I don't recall that Japan ever declared war on France. So they were done. This is a solemn and interesting time for them, and it was an interesting time to be there. Normandy was probably awash with tourists at the beginning of June, given the anniversary of D-Day, but I found what I expect is probably similar reception to Americans in the first week of May that we would find in the first week of June. People there were welcoming and excited to see me as an American. I stayed in a town called Saint-Jacques-sur-la-Mer, which is in northern Brittany, about an hour west of Mont Saint-Michel, and 15 minutes west of Saint-Malo, the train terminus to which I rode. And as my friend and I walked through the town speaking English on our way to dinner, it was very evident that the people there do not see a lot of Americans in their town. The people with whom we did speak were all very praiseworthy and welcoming. I asked them, since by then I had been there a few days, how they felt about the fact that the American Army and Navy had essentially destroyed their towns completely and forced them to rebuild. To my great astonishment, they were not upset with us about that because it came at the benefit of driving out the Germans. And more importantly than having their buildings retained or their lands unmolested, they were far more grateful to have had the Americans arrive and drive the Germans out. And I think Normandy and Brittany in particular are very welcoming towards Americans because those are the American invasion zones. If you think about D-Day invasion, the Americans had the western sector, Omaha Beach, situated just north of Bayeux, into the top of the peninsula that makes up Normandy, Saint-Mary-Église, Carentan, etc. And then we pushed into Brittany and then down south towards Tours before Patton was diverted over to Bastogne during the Battle of the Bulge. The eastern sector was the British sector, from Caen, west, Calais, Boulogne, Dunkirk, etc. And so I don't know that we're unwelcome there, but since I didn't spend a lot of time in the British invasion sector, I can't really speak to their sentiments towards Americans or towards the British. But I can say this. If we had been American soldiers and been in uniform, I'm pretty sure the French would have bought us drinks, sat us down, and said thank you. At dinner on Sunday night, Sunday, May 7th, the gentleman who was hosting us said to me that we like Americans because they are the only country that has ever invaded France, and then when they won, they went home without taking things, except for some of our women, which is an interesting throwaway line, because there were some war brides taken home, but it gave me food for thought and food for pause that the French people who had been occupied by the American army viewed us differently because, yes, we came through their towns and then we kept going. And when we were finished, we left France. We don't have any bases there. The French won't even let the American Air Force fly over France. America has no military presence there, no military involvement there. And although, aside from the fact that it's a little inconvenient, we're not perturbed about it, and we're happy to leave them to their own devices. The French people, as a consequence, don't view us as a lot of other countries where American soldiers have been, where they view us as a pest and a pestilence because we maintain a presence. If you can think of many countries like Germany, Iraq, Afghanistan, where American soldiers spent considerable amounts of time there on land that we essentially co-opted from them and put to our own devices. or even Saudi Arabia, which made some of its military bases available to us that they had actually never even used. I can't remember what the one is outside of Riyadh, but there's an air base there that the Arabians had never used, and that they made available to the United States Air Force. So we didn't come and take their land. We didn't ask for reparations. We didn't take money, at least not as a general rule. There may have been some larger level things in the political alliance, but in terms of the regular soldiers, they came, they did their job, and then they moved on, because that's what we were there to do, was to drive out the Germans. So I found it very interesting to be warmly welcomed, to go wherever I was and to find people who were willing to make an effort to compensate for my poor ability to speak French, to welcome me and to invite me back. In fact, when we showed up for dinner on Sunday, the 7th of May, we arrived and there was a tree had fallen over several days before, blocking the parking, so people were parking wherever they could, and they had cut it up into sections, and a friend of mine and we moved him out of the way to where he wanted the wood stacked, and it was very quick and very efficient, and he was very grateful. And I said two things. I said, number one, I felt like I needed to earn my dinner, since I was basically just there to eat for free. And second of all, I said, isn't that what Americans do when they come to France? They remove obstacles. And they laughed, because that is the tradition. Americans don't seem to have the bad reputation in Brittany and Normandy that they have other places. Now, it could be that during high tourist seasons in Normandy that they get tired of Americans simply because they get tired. Any tourist area gets tired of a large influx of tourists over a short period of time, and that they may be glad to see us go. But when I decided I was going to go out as the tide went out and then walk up the beach at Omaha Beach, the proprietor of the eatery, the only eatery that was open the day that we were there, um, he commented that you must be Americans, and was welcoming and tried to speak as good English to us as he could. I'm sure they see a lot of Americans in their business. Contrast that with Paris. Parisians, it was raining when I was in Paris, so I'll take that with a grain of salt, but they seemed like they were in a hurry, and they were not really interested in interfacing with me, except for the cops. In order to avoid the protests that were going on in Paris over the increase in the retirement age for French people, I decided to walk down a street, which is essentially Embassy Row, where there are a lot of embassies on both sides of the street, and there were armed guards, French police outside of each one of them. And as I walked by, they all greeted me, bonjour, bonjour, bonjour. And I'm not really accustomed to police anywhere being particularly friendly. They were the friendliest people and the only people who voluntarily spoke to me in Paris. Um, the woman at the subway was kind of annoyed that I was talking to her. I didn't really speak to a lot of people. They certainly didn't say hello. Um, Granted, I arrived at Gare Montparnasse, and I don't think there's a lot of foreigners who use the Montparnasse train station, let alone who act like they know where they're going. Because I'd done some research and I kind of knew all I needed to do was get my bearings once I left the train station to figure out which direction was west. Because it's not obvious when you're underground and you come up above ground. But Parisians weren't terribly helpful, but they weren't off-putting. They didn't treat me like crap. They just didn't really seem interested in my business. But again, there wasn't a lot of business. It wasn't a particularly good day for tourism. By the time I arrived in Paris, it had been raining there for 4 hours. And so my spirit was kind of dampened and their spirits were kind of dampened. But the biggest problems I had were in the airport. And the people in the airport were surly, unfriendly, and kind of an impediment to my successful travel. I liked everything about France except for Paris. And that doesn't mean that you can't have a good time in Paris or a good experience with Parisians. It just means that whenever people have had a problem with France, it is either one of two things. Either they've been to Paris and they have encountered the very worst Parisians that Paris has to offer, or, as my other trip to France proves, I was in Alsace-Lorraine, and the Alsatians, I think, just would really prefer that everyone who isn't there leave as soon as possible. Alsace-Lorraine is a part that changes hands every time there's a war, and switches between France and Germany depending on what the war is. Of late, they've been in France because Germany's lost both of the last two world wars, but I think they just really want foreigners to go away and leave them alone. Come here, spend your money, and then leave. And I get that. It's how I feel here, too. Come, spend your money, and then go. Particularly the Californians who muck up our streets with their unpredictable driving behavior. But I don't think French people deserve the reputation that they have as being unfriendly and unwelcoming towards Americans, or at least that's not the gist I got. Maybe it's because I went out in the middle of nowhere. Saint-Jacques-sur-le-Mer is not a very large town. Saint-Malo is not a very large town. Dinard, Bayeux, Caen, Carrington. Trying to think where else I went. Mont Saint Michel, Dole de Bretagne, Tours, Angers, Rennes. These are not places that I think see a lot of American tourists, and so I guess the sample size for feedback might be small enough that they have not figured into the calculation as positive experiences. But I can tell you that, with the exception of Paris and Strasbourg, every other place I've been in France, they were at least cordial, sometimes curious, and definitely welcoming, if anything. Most of the people in many of the places we were kind of disinterested or confused that there were Americans there. I don't think this is a time when Americans are in Carrington or Bayeux. I don't think a lot of Americans go to Tours or Rennes or Saint-Malo. They do have tourists there, but usually not Americans. So uh, anyway, if you have heard that French people are unfriendly, you might be wrong. My recommendation is, if you do go to France, that you at least spend some of your trip outside of Paris and interact with the locals there in whatever town you decide to stay in, because you might just get to see what French people are really like, especially on the western end, which was the American occupation zone, where they were definitely glad to see us. One gentleman told me in Dinard, he said, "We see you, no Germans." And I said, "Well, I speak German better than French." But they are very, very glad to have us there. I think they know that we have twice been there to make sure that the Germans go home. And then we did too. And I think they appreciate that. Anyway, stay tuned for future parts in my trip to France series coming up.